Wyoming Territory, late October, 1879. The wind was sharp, the kind that crawled under coats and carried the scent of snow not far off. Georgia Granger crouched low between two broken wagons in the livery yard at the edge of Laramie. Her shawl was wrapped tight around her shoulders, but it was not her own cold she worried about. Her son, Kellan, just 4 years old, was pressed against her chest, his little fists clinging to the folds of her skirt. He had not spoken since dusk, not even when she whispered that they were safe now. She could still hear the boots behind them, the shouting from the saloon when she had run. But that was 3 streets back, and the dark had swallowed them whole. The wagon yard smelled of horses and hay and rust. The air carried a hush, broken only by the occasional snort and shuffle of a tethered draft horse nearby. She had picked this place because no one would think to look here. Not yet. Kellan's breath warmed her neck. She rocked slightly, murmuring nonsense against his hair, her eyes darting toward the open yard, the moonlight catching on broken wheels and iron tools. Then she saw him. A man stepped into the yard, slow and quiet, his boots crunching gravel. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a tan trail coat and a rifle slung over one shoulder. His hat was pulled low, but the firelight from the stable behind him caught the edge of his jaw, unshaven, firm. He stopped when he saw them. George's hand went straight to the small revolver tucked in her boot. She did not move. Kellan stirred, letting out a whimper. The man raised his hands. "Not here to harm you," he said, voice steady. "I saw you run. Thought you might need help." She stared at him, not answering. "I am alone," he said. "Name's Callen Oakes. I work the cattle drive for the Stewart Ranch Northwest. I saw you duck in here." Kellan turned his face toward Callen, then tucked himself tighter into George's arms. "I can keep walking," Callen said after a pause. "But I figured anyone running like that's got a reason." Georgia looked down at her son, then back at the man. "You followed me." "I did," he said. "Not to scare you. Just to see you were safe." She hesitated, then nodded once. "We're not safe." Callen didn't ask why. He came closer, slow, and then crouched down in the dirt beside the wagon without a word. He did not sit too close, just enough to show he would not leave. The silence stretched. The horses shifted. Kellan let out a soft, tired sigh and reached for his mother's hand. Callen's voice was quiet. "You want to tell me what happened?" George's eyes stayed on the shadows. "He tried to take my boy." Callen did not speak. He said if I did not come back with him, he would take Kellan anyway. He said I owed him. For food. For the roof. For the years. Callen looked over at her. "That man your husband?" "No," she said. "Never was." He nodded once, not pressing further. His gaze shifted to the boy in her arms. "Is he hurt?" "No," she whispered. "Just frightened." Callen leaned back against the wheel. "You have somewhere to go?" "No," she said again, quieter. "No one. I was working in the kitchen at the boarding house, but they will not take me back now." Callen was quiet for a long time. The cold wrapped tighter around the yard, but he stayed. He did not ask her to explain more than she wanted to. He did not ask who the man was. He just sat with her, in the cold, with the stars above and the smell of horses thick in the air. "I can help," he said at last. "If you will let me." She looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes were dark, but kind. His coat was worn, boots scuffed from trail dust. He looked like a man who had seen hard miles. She wondered what he saw when he looked back at her, a woman with nothing but a child and a gun and a past she could not outrun. But he had not left. "How do I know you mean it?" she asked. Callen looked at her, slow and sure. "Because I do not make promises I cannot keep. And I promise you, Georgia Granger, you and your boy will be safe." Her breath caught a little at the sound of her name. He had not asked it. He had just known. She blinked, unsure if it was fear or something else rising in her chest. "And after tonight, I will still be here." Kellan stirred again, his small hand reaching out toward Callen's coat. Callen did not move, just let the boy touch the worn fabric. George's shoulders slumped. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding herself until now. The tears came quiet, no sobs, just the kind that slipped out when the body could no longer hold them back. Callen pulled a folded blanket from his saddlebag and held it out. "It's clean," he said. "You both look like you need it." She took it wordlessly and wrapped Kellan in it. Callen stayed beside them until the moon was high. They did not speak more. He just sat there, his presence steady as the earth, And something in Georgia, something tired and locked up for too long, began to unclench. She looked at him once more before closing her eyes. "Thank you." He nodded. That night, in the wagon yard, with her son asleep against her and a stranger sitting beside them in silence, Georgia felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. By dawn, the frost had silvered the wagon wheels and stiffened the earth beneath them. Georgia shifted slowly, careful not to jostle Kellan, still wrapped in the borrowed blanket. She hadn't slept, but her body had drifted in and out of stillness, heart ticking steady beneath her ribs. Callen stood now, brushing hay from his trousers, his rifle already slung back across his shoulder. He hadn't spoken since before midnight, not even when the wind picked up and a dog barked somewhere far off. He'd stayed, though. That had meant more than words. "I've got a borrowed mule hitched behind the smithy," he said, voice low. "If you're willing, I can take you both out of town before anyone's stirring." She watched him. His coat was buttoned against the cold, and his hat sat straight, not low like the night before. In the soft light, he looked older than she'd thought, creases at the corners of his eyes, a quiet weariness in the way he stood. Not tired in body. Tired in the heart, maybe. She knew that kind of tired. "I can walk," she said, shifting Kellan gently into her arms. Callen didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a wool scarf from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "It's clean," he said. "You'll want something more for him." She wrapped it around Kellan's legs without a word. They moved together through the waking yard, boots crunching softly over frost. Callen led them down behind the stables, where the mule waited tethered beside a narrow trail that dipped into the cottonwoods. Georgia settled behind the saddle, holding Kellan close in front of her. Callen walked beside them, his hand steady on the lead rope. They didn't speak until the town had faded behind them, the trail winding west toward the hills. The sun was rising slow, casting pale gold through the bare branches overhead. "You were headed anywhere?" Callen asked, eyes on the trail ahead. She shook her head. "Didn't think past getting him away." "You've got grit," he said. "Most would have frozen up." "I did," Georgia said softly. "For a long time." He glanced back at her then, just once. "You didn't last night." They passed a fallen tree, its trunk hollowed with rot. A crow burst from its branches and flew low over the trail. Kellan stirred, rubbing his face against her shoulder. "He's used to being quiet," she said, adjusting the scarf. "He learned early." Callen nodded but didn't answer. After a mile, he pointed toward a gap in the hills. "I stay up that way, on a line cabin the Stewart hands use when they're rotating cattle. There's a stove, cot, and water not far off. No one else will be there this week, and no one will think to look." Georgia studied his profile. "Would they take issue with you bringing strangers?" "I already cleared it last season," he said. "I do farrier work for them too, when needed. They leave me to it." She watched the way his boots landed steady on the frozen path. He moved like a man used to walking alone, sure of his steps, but never in a hurry. "I can help with cooking," she said quietly. "And I clean quick. I don't sit idle." "You won't be beholden," he said. "You're not a kept guest. You're safe company." She didn't answer, but her grip on Kellan loosened slightly. By midday, they reached the cabin. It stood firm against the slope, made of thick-hewn pine with a pitched roof and a single iron flue. Smoke from a recent fire still clung faintly to the air. Callen opened the door, holding it wide without stepping ahead of her. Inside was plain but cared for. A cot pushed against the back wall, a wood stove with a kettle, shelves lined with tin and dried goods. A patchwork quilt hung from a nail near the window. Georgia stepped in and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She set Kellan down gently on the cot. He blinked up at her, then curled onto his side, not quite asleep but drifting. Callen set his rifle near the stove and tossed a few logs in, coaxing the fire to life. "You built this?" she asked after a while. "No," he said, adjusting the damper. "But I've fixed it near enough times it feels like mine." She slipped out of her shawl and folded it over the chair by the door. Her hands shook a little from more than cold. Callen poured water into the kettle. "He'll sleep long," he said. "You should eat something. There's bread and beans." "Not much, but it'll hold you." She moved toward the shelf, careful not to disturb anything. "You live out here year-round?" "Most winters," he said. "Town's loud. I don't take to noise." She turned to look at him. "You don't ask many questions." "I figure people tell what they want told," he said. Same as me. Georgia nodded. That kind of quiet she understood. She ladled beans into a tin bowl and sat near the stove, the heat slowly unknotting her shoulders. She didn't thank him again. She didn't need to. He hadn't done it for thanks. Callen leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes on the trees beyond. The light caught the edge of his jaw again, and she saw the faint scar that ran just beneath his ear. You ever have family? She asked, surprising herself. He didn't look at her. Had a brother. Died near Abilene. Too many men with too many rifles, and he wasn't good at ducking. She watched the back of his neck, the way his shoulders stiffened just enough to betray the cost of the words. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. Me too. The kettle hissed on the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, sweeping sighs. Georgia stood and walked to the cot. She touched Kellan's cheek, then pulled the quilt down over him. When she turned, Callen was still at the door, still not looking at her. I don't know what tomorrow brings, she said, but I'll earn our place. You already have, he said, finally meeting her eyes. She didn't look away. Neither did he. The snow came 2 days later, soft and slow, covering the ground in a thin hush. It didn't last long, but enough to keep them close to the cabin. Kellan delighted at the flakes, catching them on his mittens while Georgia watched from the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. Inside, Callen was fixing a cracked hinge on the cupboard door with a strip of leather and 2 iron nails he'd scavenged from the shed. His movements were quiet, methodical. He didn't speak unless there was cause, but Georgia had come to understand the weight behind his silences. They were never empty. That morning, after the snow stopped, she brewed coffee in the dented kettle, measured and careful. She brought him a cup without asking. He took it with a nod, his fingers brushing hers for the first time. Later, while Kellan napped, Georgia stood near the window, drying her hands on the hem of her skirt. You always live this far from things, she asked, not turning. I do better with distance, Callen answered, setting down his cup. Too many people forget how to leave each other be. You think I should have run farther? I think you ran far enough to matter. She turned to him then, her eyes sharp. He'll come looking. If he does, he won't find you here. She studied him, her voice low. You sound sure. I've watched men like him, Callen said. They're loud when they think they've got power, quieter when they lose control. He stood, pacing slowly toward the stove. The fire had dropped low, and he knelt to feed it. You ever lose it? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Then once. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he reached for a tin of salt and set it on the shelf with deliberate care. Georgia crossed the room and lifted the kettle off the hook, refilling it from the barrel. You fix things like you've been doing it a long while. I had to learn, he said. Nobody else would have. She poured the water, then looked at him. You ever mind being alone? He met her gaze. Used to think I needed it. And now? I'm not sure. They stood in the quiet, the only sound the soft settling of wood in the stove. She didn't look away. You know, she said, you could have let us pass. Stayed out of it. I know. But you didn't. I didn't. She stepped closer, not quite touching him. Why? Callen's voice was rough. Because you looked like someone who'd spent too long waiting for help that never came. Georgia didn't speak. Her throat tightened, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. Didn't seem right, he added. Kellan stirred on the cot, shifting beneath the quilt. Georgia turned toward him, but her hand brushed Callen's sleeve as she moved. He didn't flinch. That evening, Callen brought in 2 rabbits, caught near the ravine. Georgia cleaned them without fuss, her fingers quick and practiced. He watched her work, noting the steadiness in her hands, the way she never wasted emotion. You grew up near mountains? He asked. No, she said. Flat plains, east of Wichita. Dusty. Dry. Nothing but wind. Hard land. Hard people, she said. My father died in a fire. Mother followed a year later. After that, I worked where I could. Took what I could carry. You carried him, Callen said, glancing toward Kellan. I carried him, she echoed. They ate by lantern light, the stew rich despite the plain fare. Kellan asked Callen to tell him about horses, and Callen obliged, describing the different brands he'd seen on trails, how to calm a spooked colt, how to find water by the bend of a canyon wall. Georgia listened without speaking, her eyes softer than they'd been in days. When the boy slept again, she folded the quilt neatly, her fingertips lingering on the frayed edge. "I still wake up ready to run," she said, voice low. "You don't have to hear." "I know." She turned to look at him. "I keep trying to believe it." Callen stepped forward, then not close, but close enough that she could feel it. "I'll give you the time you need," he said. Georgia nodded. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." "You won't be," he said. "Not with me here." The wind pressed against the walls as night deepened. Georgia crossed the room, her steps slow but certain. She placed her hand over his, where it rested on the table. "I'm still learning how to trust," she said. He looked at her, steady. "I'll prove you can," he said. Neither moved for a long time. The cabin was quiet, but full. The kind of full that came from two people standing still, not out of fear, but choice. By the fifth day, the snow had melted back into the hills, leaving the ground soft and dark in its wake. Georgia was outside early, shaking out linens and hanging them between two trees with twine Callen had shown her how to tie. The air smelled of thawed earth and pine bark. Kellan stood nearby, poking a stick into the damp ground, his boots muddy up to the ankles. Callen came from the ridge line, a rabbit and two quail slung over his shoulder. His coat was damp at the hem, and his hands were red with cold. He paused when he saw them, then walked the last stretch slow, his eyes lingering on George's face longer than they once did. She didn't speak until he set the birds on the chopping block and rinsed his hands with water from the bucket. "You always hunt alone?" she asked, tying the last sheet. Callen shook the water from his fingers and pulled off his gloves. "Better that way." "I could learn," she said. He looked at her, then down at Kellan, who was now crouched, tracing something in the mud. "You ever fired for game before?" he asked. "Only once," she said. "Wasn't proud of it. Took me 3 tries and most of my nerve." "You got it in the end?" "I did," she said. "And it fed us 2 days." Callen studied her a moment, then nodded. "I'll teach you." They didn't speak more on it, but that afternoon, he showed her the balance of a rifle, how to brace with her hip, how wind pulled at the shot. He didn't touch her hands, just stood close enough to correct her with words. Georgia listened, jaw set in concentration. When she missed 3 times, she swore under her breath. Callen took the rifle, aimed once, then lowered it again. "You're holding like you're expecting pain." Georgia adjusted her stance. "I'm used to things kicking back." He didn't answer that, just loaded another round and handed it to her. By dusk, she hit the tree trunk clean. Kellan clapped from where he sat on the log, swinging his legs. Georgia lowered the rifle with a slow grin, the kind that came not from pride but from surprise. Callen gave a single nod. "Next time we go for meat." That night, after Kellan had curled into the cot and the fire had burned low, Georgia stirred a pot of cornmeal over the stove. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, hair pulled back with a strip of cloth. Callen sat at the table, mending a saddle strap. "You ever been married?" she asked without looking up. Callen's needle paused mid-stitch. "No," she waited. "Worked too many seasons, moved too many places," he said. "Never stayed long enough to ask." Georgia set the spoon aside. "But you wanted to." He leaned back in the chair. "Once. She married someone steadier. Left a letter. Said I was good, just not settled." Georgia folded a cloth over the pot. "You think she was right?" "I think she needed more than silence and dry ground." Georgia sat across from him, her arms resting on the table. "And what do you need?" Callen looked at her for a long moment. "Someone who sees the quiet and doesn't try to fill it." She didn't look away. "I can do that." His hand was still holding the leather strap. She laid hers beside it close, not touching. The fire snapped in the stove, but neither of them moved. "You ever think about starting again?" he asked, voice low. "I never stopped thinking about it," she said. "Only stopped believing I could." Callen's thumb brushed the grain of the table. "You could hear. If you wanted." Georgia breathed in slow. "I do." Outside, the wind had settled. The night stretched wide and still, and inside that cabin, something long buried stirred between them, not sudden and not loud but certain. Callen reached across the table and turned her hand gently into his. "Then we'll build something. Slow, but solid." Georgia closed her fingers around his. Together, he nodded once. Every step. The thaw held. By the second week of November, the days stretched longer, and the land showed signs of softening mud at the edge of the creek, green blades pushing through frost-bitten grass. The mornings were still cold, but the sun climbed higher than before, touching the slope behind the cabin where Callen had cleared old brush. Georgia stood by the stream, sleeves rolled, washing Kellan's shirt against a flat stone. Her hands were red from the cold water, but her movements were practiced. She glanced up when Callen approached, leading the mule with a sack of seed slung over the saddle. He crouched beside her, dipping his hands into the cold stream. "You're back early," she said, wringing out the shirt. Store in town was quiet. Stewart's foreman passed word they're offering a plot on the East Ridge to anyone willing to fence it and work it come spring. Georgia looked sideways at him. "You thinking of taking it?" He met her gaze. "I was thinking we might." She stilled, water dripping from the fabric between her fingers. "It's rough land," he said. "But it's ours if we claim it. No one above us, no one crowding close. Just space enough to build and grow. I can do the fencing. You'd have say in the rest." Georgia folded the shirt over her arm. It'd be a beginning. Callen stood, brushing his hands dry on his trousers. "You'd have to want it." She rose beside him. "I do." They walked back in step, neither speaking, but the quiet between them had shifted. It was no longer laced with uncertainty. It felt like something decided, not rushed, not pressed but earned. Inside the cabin, Kellan was stacking pine cones along the window ledge. He looked up when they entered, smiling wide. Callen knelt in front of him. "How would you feel about a house with a barn? Big yard? Maybe a few chickens to chase?" Kellan's eyes lit up. "Can we bring the mule?" Callen chuckled. "Wouldn't leave her behind." Georgia watched from the stove, her hand resting on the back of the chair. The light caught in her hair, and for the first time in years, she looked like a woman not bracing for the next blow. That night, they sat outside on the cabin's stoop, wrapped in one of the quilts. Kellan was asleep inside. The door cracked enough to hear if he stirred. The stars stretched wide overhead, clear and cold. "I've been thinking," she said, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, "about things I never thought I'd have." Callen tilted his head just enough to brush her temple with his cheek. "Like what?" "Like waking up next to someone who doesn't expect me to owe them for kindness. Like having a garden with rows that stay planted. Like sitting still and not flinching when the wind rises." He was quiet a moment. "You'll have all of that. And more." She turned toward him. "You're sure?" He took her hand, pressing it against his chest. "I've never been more." The next day, they rode out to the East Ridge. It was rough, as he'd said, stones scattered through the grass, a stand of crooked juniper at the north edge, but the view stretched wide, and the soil turned dark where Georgia pressed her boot. They marked the corners with branches. Callen showed Kellan how to drive the stakes, letting him hammer gently with the back of a hatchet. Georgia walked the line twice, counting her steps, picturing where the doorway would face. That night, she boiled potatoes in the kettle and pulled out the last of the salt pork. Callen opened a jar of preserved peaches he'd traded for in town. They ate by lantern light, and when Georgia reached for his hand without thinking, he laced their fingers together like it was the most natural thing in the world. Winter settled in full by month's end. The wind grew sharper, and the snow returned, heavier than before. But the cabin stayed warm, the stove burning steady. Kellan learned his letters by the fire, and Georgia taught him to hold a pencil with care. Callen strung snares along the ridge and carved fence posts from fallen timber. One morning, after the snow had drifted high against the door, Georgia found a wooden box on the table. Inside was a silver ring, simple, without polish. Carved on the inside, in careful lettering, were the words, "Found, not taken." She looked up. Callen stood across from her, his thumb hooked in his belt. "It's not from a store," he said. "Made it myself. Might not be pretty, but it'll last." She crossed the room and placed the ring on her finger. "Then it's perfect." They were married in early spring, under a cottonwood tree near the creek. Callen wore his best shirt, and Georgia wore a dress she'd sewn from a bolt of calico Callen had bartered for in town. Kellan stood between them, holding both their hands, grinning with all his teeth. Stewart's foreman came to witness, bringing a Bible and a bottle of corn whiskey. The vows were short, spoken soft, but true. When Callen kissed her, Georgia didn't tremble. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear. They moved to the ridge in April, the cabin nearly done by then. Callen built it strong, every beam placed with care. Georgia planted beans and onions in the first row, her apron dusted with soil. Kellan chased a stray chicken through the dirt yard, laughing so loud it echoed off the hills. At night, they slept with the windows open, the three of them close beneath a single quilt. Georgia no longer waited for footsteps in the dark. Callen no longer counted the miles behind him. They had nothing grand, no piano, no oil portraits on the walls, but what they had was honest and lasting, and theirs. And in the quiet that came after long days, with the lantern low and the fire crackling soft, Georgia would reach for Callen's hand and hold it just so. Because she was not running anymore. Because he was not alone. Because they had found, in each other, the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be known.